Hi there and welcome to my new video. Today I'm going to show you how to speed paint a bright Stormcast Eternal's Vindicator in classic colors of Hammers of Sigmar. For this figure I will use True Metallic Metals technique, also known as TTM. First we need to prime the model with light grey primer. I use Surface Primer Grey. After the primer is cured, I cover the whole model with Dwarven gold from scale 75. For this, I'm using an airbrush, but you can also do this with a regular brush. After the base coat is done, we need to shade it. For this, I use Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop. I generously apply the paint to all surfaces, trying to avoid it pulling in the recesses. Shades are a great tool that allows you to easily define the shadows on models, especially on game models. While I wait for the shade to dry, I move on to the other parts of the model. Now is a good time to paint all non-metallic areas. Let's start with the blue. For the base coat, I use navy blue and Mediterranean blue mixed in approximately 1:1 ratio. I apply this mix to the shield, knees and shoulder pads. When you apply base coat, I recommend to thin the paint down with water in approximately 1:1 ratio. Remember, it's better to apply several thin coats than one fat one. After the base coat has dried, we can start highlighting. For the first layer I use pure Mediterranean blue, thinned with water in 1:2 ratio. I use layering technique for the majority of highlights. That means that I outline all the edges and then use thin layers of paint to create gradient on open surfaces. For the next layer of highlights, I use a roughly equal mix of Mediterranean blue and sky blue. Layering is a technique that benefits greatly from intermediate layers. The more layers you do, the smoother will be the transition. I once again work with all the edges and open areas, this time trying to make the area of application smaller than before to create smoother gradient. For the third highlight, I use pure sky blue, again thinned down with water in 1:2 ratio. This time I try to cover less space on the edges to create better contrast. On open areas the principle is the same, cover less space to create gradient. The fourth and the last highlight I do with a roughly equal mix of sky blue and white. This time I mostly work with the edges. To create light weathering effect, I apply the paint with rough lines and dots. After the edges, I return to the open areas and again apply some rough lines and dots. The blue is done. Now let's paint spear and dagger handles. For the base layer I use deep red thinned down in 1:1 ratio. I then highlight the handles with Antares Red. I try to cover the whole area, but leave the darker red in the deepest recesses. For the next and final highlight, I use Aldebaran Red. I paint only the most prominent parts of the handles in order to create subtle gradient. Now let's move on to leather and claws. For the base layer I cover all leather belts and claws in between armor panels with black from scale 75. I decided to work on the cloth in between armor panels first. To highlight it, I use Graphene Grey. I thin the paint in 1:2 ratio and apply it to all raised areas. For the second layer, I add equal amount of white into my Graphene Grey. I once again highlight only the most prominent parts of the cloth, covering even less space than before. The cloth is finished. Now let's move on to the leather. For the first layer I use Dubai Brown. I paint rough, harsh lines to create an illusion of old leather. The paint is again thinned in 1:2 ratio. For the second layer I use orange leather and once again apply small lines to create texture. As a final highlight, I use Mars Orange to paint little dots and lines on the edges. And at this point, I call leather elements done. Now let's return to metallics. I cover all steel elements with gunmetal from MIG. After that, I shade all these areas with Nuln Oil from Games Workshop. I apply this paint quite generously, making sure that it does not pull in the recesses. After the shade is dry, I decide to emphasize the shadows on the steel with some black ink from Vallejo. Ink is rather thin and has very small pigment, which makes it a great tool for color modification. I thin the paint in 1:1 ratio and apply it to only the most shaded areas. I apply several layers of paint on the opposite sides of the spearhead. This will allow me to create better contrast later on. Now let's define the shadows on gold. For this I use brown ink from Vallejo, then with water in 1:1 ratio. I don't have a clear guide on where to place the shadows, but I have two rules. First, in the majority of cases, the shadow is located at the bottom of the elements. Second, the model should look nice and pretty from all angles. A game model like this one is made for the tabletop, so the rule of thumb is it should be bright and have plenty of contrast. So I do not worry whether my light and shadow placement is realistic or not. If you want to learn more about how I place shadows and light on my models, let me know in the comments below. I may do a separate video on the subject. Now that all the non-metallic elements are done and I have finished modifying the metallics, I apply matte varnish. More specifically, acrylic matte varnish from Vallejo. This step allows me to unify the texture and create a base for future contrast between matte shadows and glittering highlights on metal elements. This is one of the easiest ways to create light and shadow placement in TMM. After the varnish is dry, I start to highlight the steel with polished metal from MIG. I thin the paint with water in 1:1 ratio. This consistency is ideal for working on details and gradient. I stipple the paint onto the model to make it shine. At this point, try not to overload the brush with too much paint. The less paint you have, the easier it is to apply it. Let's stop on the spearhead and I will show you how to apply the paint. At first, I carefully stipple the paint onto the opposite sides of the blade. Then I highlight the edges. And to finish things off, I apply random dots and lines to simulate scratches. Time to highlight the gold. For this, I use Elven gold from scale 75. This is the last and the most important step, as the gold is the main color in this color scheme. As with steel previously, I once again thin the paint with water in 1:1 ratio. I start with the edges and then move on to open areas. In this case, the majority of lights on the open areas will be looking upwards, but once again I do not forget that my main goal is to create pretty and balanced results from all angles. Realism takes backseat here. At this stage you can already see the contrast between matte shadows and glittering highlights on metallics. This way the model looks as if it's placed under natural light. I use this approach while highlighting all golden elements. And so the model is finished. Now we only need to place it on a pre-made base. Now my Stormcast Eternal's Vindictor from Hammers of Sigmar is ready to conquer battlefields. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was useful and educational. What do you think about this model, and which model should I paint for my next tutorial? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want to support this channel and see more videos like this. I'd like to thank all my patrons who made this video possible. And if you want to help me make more tutorials and get access to all the previous guides, you can find the link to my Patreon in the description.